Okay, so moving on then, in the next chapter of the story of my life, an electronic autobiography. Um, so just before we had gotten pregnant, I think it was a little ways, maybe it was like a year before that. The job that I was working as a manager of a bookstore in North Beach, um, she had lost her job working as an advertiser for escort agencies, and she was looking for a job. And I said, well, why don't you just come work with me? And so I contacted the employer, and I told them she had bookstore experience and very good managerial skills. So they allowed me to hire her. So she came on board in the bookstore. And for about the last 2 years, I think we ran the bookstore together. Um, very good, very hard worker, very skillful, very organized. She just brought a lot of order and harmony into the place, made things look better. She was excellent. Every now and then, of course, we'd sneak upstairs into the office and have sex. That was a regular occurrence. But when the kid came, they allowed us to bring him to work with us, which was great because we didn't have to pay for daycare. And so we brought him in, and we put him in a crib behind the cash register, and the two of us I would usually be shelving books. She'd be sitting at the cash register, or vice versa. We'd take turns. And so the kid's earliest memories are obviously going to be of being surrounded by books. Books everywhere. There were stacks of books behind him. We thoroughly imprinted him with literary intelligence, and to this day, I think he's a very literate individual. He'll be a reader all of his life. And we read to him from day one, always reading him stories every night. And so, but the problem now with this bookstore, I'd been there 5 years, and it wasn't making any money for the owners. It was just break even. Used bookstore across the street from City Lights, and that is just no longer. In spite of that, it's no longer a literary neighborhood. In spite of its inheritance from the Beats having been there, it's all porn shops and cafes and fine dining. Not a very literary town. Some of the strippers would come in and bored and be looking for a book. And occasionally I'd sell them a bestseller of some sort or other, a science fiction novel or whatever they were into. And it just wasn't happening. It wasn't going to happen. We gave it 5 years. And so the owners let me go. And they were like, we want to try another manager. We're going to bring in a woman to run the place and see what happens. And I said, that's fine. It's not me. It's the neighborhood. I guarantee it. And of course I was right. The woman who came in ran the place for about 2 years, could do absolutely nothing with it, and the store closed down. So I knew that it had to do with the neighborhood. It wasn't me. I did everything I could think of to make that ship float, but it just would not. So another crisis came after I lost that job, and we had the kid. Now we're out of money. And so we were frantically looking at our options, and they were either to move to Boulder. She was from Colorado. So she had a lot of family members living in Colorado, but most of them lived in Phoenix, and all mine lived in Phoenix. So we thought about, hey, Phoenix, both families live there, lots of free babysitting. Let's do it. So Phoenix it was. But we made a mistake, a big one, of renting a house. It was a very large house with cheap rent because it was in Queen Creek. And Queen Creek at that time was completely isolated away from the rest of the city. It was a suburban development, brand new, but right out in the middle of the desert, and it was an hour's commute to go anywhere in the city. But the rent was cheap and the house was big, so we rented it. And the problem with that was that I had to drive an hour. I got another bookstore job, and I had to drive an hour to a minimum wage bookstore job and drive home for an hour. 2-hour commute for a minimum wage job, working 40 hours a week. Do the math on that, and it winds up for just enough to cover daycare. So why do the daycare? So that pretty much, it put a lot of stress on the marriage, the financial problems. Then there was another issue with this house. It was infested with scorpions. At first, I just noticed out in the backyard an occasional dead scorpion. I grew up in Phoenix. I hadn't seen very many scorpions, 1 or 2 my entire life. And now I started noticing dead scorpion bodies all over the property, and that the house next door was empty. And I peered over the fence, and I wondered about that. And then one afternoon, sure enough, a scorpion got into the house, a bark scorpion, a very dangerous, highly toxic, poisonous type of scorpion, and I squashed it, stepped on it immediately, killed it. And actually, you know what? I take that back. what actually happened, I just remember, okay, it's funny how memory distorts things in your favor. What actually happened was, again, a role reversal. I went and grabbed the kid because he was playing on the floor. I went and grabbed the kid and I held him while she dealt with the scorpion. I remember her, she took a can of Lysol and sprayed it and then slammed a book on top of it. Or I did. I might have killed it with the, I don't know. Some of this traumatic stuff gets blurry, but anyway, it was dead. But it put a lot of stress once again on the situation. And I was like, we can't raise a 3-year-old kid here in a property that's infested with scorpions. This isn't going to work. And so it didn't. But we split, and each of us wound up with our respective families. I moved in with my mother, and then her family helped her get an apartment while she worked. But there again, I was back and forth at her apartment complex, taking care of the kid as daycare, because I was in between jobs. I couldn't find a bookstore job. It took a little while, about a year for me to find more bookstore employment. And so I spent the days at her property raising the kid, loading him up on my backpack, and we go hiking through the desert, me and the kid, and just unload him. We'd play with a bunch of little toys, cars and stuff. I'd pack him up on my back, and then we'd hike back to the apartment. And we did this most every afternoon while she got a job, I think, working at a pool supply company. And there she was, that was the job where she was loaning out all her porn. And at that time, porn was just DVDs. And we'd get the discs back, and they'd be all smeared and smudged. And it's like, we can't watch these now. Why are you doing this? But she's flirting with everyone. That's just the way she always was, extrovert, flirty. So she was working that job, and I was taking care of the kid. And she was jealous about that situation because she wanted it to be the reverse. But the problem was I was also struggling with my writing. I was intent, 100% intent on becoming a successful writer. That was my view. Everything else became secondary to that goal. And I was struggling at the time with an early draft of a novel about Gilgamesh that wasn't very good, despite all the research I put into it. And I sent it to William Irwin Thompson. He pissed all over it. And I realized, yeah, he had a point. It was bad. So I spent like 6 months of that period wrestling with that damn Gilgamesh novel. I finally got it later on. Years later, I got it down and then self-published it. It's available on Amazon now, called Gilgamesh Redux. I got it right, but it took a long time. But I was really struggling. My second book had come out right after we got back to Phoenix in 2005, Celluloid Heroes and Mechanical Dragons. So that book had come out. So now I was struggling trying to figure out what to write about, and I was engaged in the study, a very intensive study of ancient history and high civilizations. I was especially focused on learning everything I could about Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and so forth, and Egypt, and learning those civilizations in detail, almost to the degree of becoming a specialist. I really wanted to know why civilization came into being, what the forces were that brought these first world cities into being. And I found out all kinds of cool things, made tons of notes, but it took me years of study to delve into that and figure all that out. And I worked on a manuscript about the history of burial practices as they changed through the Paleolithic, Neolithic, on into high civilization of the Bronze Age, and then the Millennium Crisis in the second millennium BC. All the burial cults changed in tracking their transformations. But I couldn't quite ever get it right. And the book remains unpublished to this day, although I converted it into an oral file on Google Play called The Evolution of the Afterlife. Now, so what happened then was I'm struggling with my writing, raising the kid. She doesn't want to do the job that she's doing. And then so we got into a situation where it was time for a divorce. I think the kid was 5. And I went over to her apartment one day and she said, I think we need to part. We need to go separate ways. What you want is not what I want anymore. You want to become a writer, and it's taking you forever. You're not bringing in money. And she just lost faith. It's too bad because I wanted to keep the marriage going. It was a stable, monogamous, committed marriage. I was happy with it, even though it was a struggle. But it was hard on the kid. Our fighting, we were fighting a lot. It was hard on the kid. And then we noticed that, so we split. In 2008, we divorced, even though we continued to have sex for about another year or two after that, but it was mostly amicable at first. it was pretty amicable. I was like, all right, if this is what you want to do. But the kid now, as he was reaching about the age of 5, had to enter into kindergarten. And once we put him in the school system, it was one disaster after the next. For the next 5 years of his life, the poor kid suffered going through the public school system. And we knew something, that he had something, not a learning disability, because he was extremely bright, extremely high IQ. He was into Einsteinian physics and relativity and quantum mechanics, and I was learning things from him about quantum mechanics and particle behavior, the stuff that he was picking up off of Nova and Netflix science documentaries. He was addicted to science documentaries all through that period, from when he was 5 years old down to when he was 10. And extremely, there were no learning disabilities. The problem was social disabilities. He could not get along with the other kids, and he was getting into fights. And so things were getting difficult. He was bouncing around. Then the '08 crash came. And when the '08 crash came, it wasn't a surprise to me, and it wasn't a surprise to anyone conversant with astrology. We had been expecting it for years. We had predicted it because of the Pluto, Uranus, and Saturn formed a perfect T-square in the sky, which it does like once or twice a century, and is always associated with financial collapse and disaster. And it was right on target for 2008 to 2011, right in there. No astrologer was surprised by that '08 crash. But there were no jobs for her, and her family, her sisters had begun moving back up to Colorado, up to Denver, and they were telling her, hey, there are jobs here in Boulder and Denver, come up here. So she took the kid and moved up to Boulder and got a job there. And I had to finish out my lease. I had gotten a good, stable 9-to-5 bookstore job, working for an excellent bookstore in Mesa. I was very happy with that job, and I hated to leave it. I worked there for about a year and a half, and then I wanted to go be with my kid up in Boulder. So I finished out my lease, and in the spring of 2009, left for Boulder. So I moved up to Boulder. Boulder wasn't any easier. And there again, I got another bookstore job working for a bookstore in Pearl Street. Worked there for 2 years. I had a hard time in Boulder. I had a hard time making friends. I had a hard time connecting with people. I was mostly alone and isolated. And I was helping raise the kid. He was having trouble in school, and continually, almost every day, they were telling me, she would call and say, you got to go pick up our son. You need to go pick him up. He's constantly being disciplined. He's constantly doing things that disrupt the flow there. It's clear that public school wasn't going to work for him. So eventually, we wound up homeschooling him later on. And at that point, once I homeschooled him, he got straight A's. Very bright kid, very gifted, very high intelligence. Probably inherited the science gene from my rocket scientist grandfather. Super bright about physics and stuff like that. So, meanwhile, my career, I had published my third book while up in Boulder. I finished it, Dead Celebrities, Living Icons. And that book was a bit of a transition for me because I started opening the doors to French postmodern philosophy. I became interested in reading Paul Virilio and Jean Baudrillard, and I read all of their books while writing that book. And I finished it up in Boulder. It was just about to go to press, and then Michael Jackson died. And they're like, you got to add a chapter on Michael Jackson. So I did. I put a chapter in there on Michael Jackson. And the book was published in 2010 as my third book. But now, in my head was beginning a landslide of ideas for all kinds of books. And at first, I conceived The Age of Catastrophe and New Media Invasion simultaneously. They were simultaneous occurrences. And I was writing both of them in Boulder, going back and forth. I was inspired by, at the Science Museum in Denver, an exhibition of catastrophes in that Science Museum that to me kind of made these catastrophes look almost like works of art. They were displayed like an installation with dioramas, huge pictures of tornadoes and earthquakes. And I had been reading a lot of Paul Virilio, who talks about accidentology quite a bit in his books, and I thought, well, maybe it's possible to write a book that treats accidents almost like works of art, and you talk about them and go through an exegesis of what the semiotics hidden inside each of these catastrophes is. So I began to conceive that idea and start working on it. And at the same time, I went to Tower Records one day up the street, and it was closed. Closed for business, gone. All the records gone, everything gone. And all of a sudden I was scratching my head, and I was like, Tower Records has gone out of business? What's happening here? And then I looked, and bookstores I noticed had been closing for years because of the internet. The internet basically put the book industry out of business as far as bricks and mortar go. But now here goes everything else down the tubes into hyperspace, into the space, the digitized space of hypermodernity. The world interior was being created that was sucking out all the stores from shopping malls and retail spaces and leaving behind hollow, vacant exoskeletons, shells left behind like creatures crawled from the ocean and then leave their shell behind and shed it. And that's what we were seeing with the department store becoming an empty shell. And so I thought, I wonder what McLuhan would have said about all this new media, Facebook and YouTube and Google. And I thought, well, I know his work pretty well. Maybe I'll sit down and see what I can think of. So I sat down and I started writing essays about YouTube and Google and Amazon, Wikipedia. I found out about WikiLeaks. So I wrote that whole book in Boulder. And by the time I returned to Phoenix, they were both published. New Media Invasion in 2011 and The Age of Catastrophe in 2012. But a whole horizon of books had already appeared in my head that followed that, one after the next. But Boulder didn't work out. I tried to make it work. I just couldn't. I didn't like the snow. I didn't like the winters. I wasn't making any friends there. And I realized very much to my unhappiness that it wasn't going to work. I said goodbye to my kid. It was very emotional, very tearful. It was extremely traumatic and upsetting. So I went back to Phoenix to live with my mother. I moved in with her to try and figure out at that point now what to do with all of this chaos. So we'll leave it there for this episode.